cardiac device compliance files on camera and called them outdated paperwork. Those files were the only thing standing between his father's company and an FDA consent decree. I watched it happen on my laptop from my office 60 feet down the hall. My name is James Pearson. I'm 48 years old. I spent 12 years in the United States Navy as a submarine service hospital corpsman, and I left as a petty officer first class. After the Navy, I spent 20 years at Roswell Medical Systems building every regulatory system they use for cardiac devices. Every FDA 510 kilo submission, every quality management protocol, every Class 3 device inspection, it all went through my office. The Livestream showed Braden Cross standing at the front of the main conference room, sleeves rolled up like he was about to do actual work for the first time in his life. They'd wheeled in a commercial shredder, the industrial kind you use for cardboard, not documentation. He wanted the sound, he wanted the show. 200 employees watched across 3 buildings, some on screens in break rooms, some at their desks, some standing in the back of the conference room with their arms crossed and faces blank. The smart ones stayed quiet. Braden held up a binder, white 3-inch spine, tabbed with color-coded dividers I'd organized 8 years ago. He read the label out loud. FDA Quality Management System, Cardiac Devices Division, Revision 12. He held it up like a prop. Then he dropped it into the shredder. The machine screamed. 200 people heard it. This, Braden said, gesturing at the table stacked with manila folders and binders, represents the old way of thinking. Today, the Department of No becomes the Department of Go applause from maybe 30% of the room. The rest stayed silent. The silent ones knew what those binders contained. I closed my laptop at 2:47 p.m., not because I was upset, because I'd seen enough to know what came next. I opened my encrypted personal drive and copied the full town hall recording. Video file, metadata, timestamps, distribution logs. Then I copied it again to a second backup. This wasn't paranoia. This was protocol. The Navy taught me that missing documentation kills sailors. Missing inspection protocols kill patients. At 3:15 p.m., Braden walked into my office with Helen Murphy from HR. She held a tablet against her chest and wouldn't make eye contact. She stood behind Braden like someone watching a bomb disposal. Braden sat in the chair across from my desk without being invited. He adjusted his cuffs. Rolex Submariner caught the fluorescent light. His father bought him that watch. We're making structural changes, Jim. Your function is being reimagined. He said reimagined like he'd been practicing the word. I looked at him, 32 years old, perfect haircut, Harvard MBA. He'd mentioned Harvard in the first sentence of every introduction since his father created the Chief Innovation Officer title 6 months ago. Before that, he'd bounced between marketing and business development with performance reviews I'd seen described as developing. I see, I said. Braden leaned forward with a speech prepared. I could tell because his eyes moved left, accessing memory instead of forming thoughts. The compliance function has become a friction point in our innovation pipeline. We need agile methodologies, not regulatory gatekeeping. I'm bringing in a transformation consultant to rebuild the quality architecture from the ground up. Fresh perspective, modern approach. The board wants velocity, Jim. Not binders. The board hadn't been consulted. I knew this because Charles Davidson, Roswell's general counsel, would have warned me. Charles had sent Harold Cross 2 memos about giving Braden operational authority. Harold had ignored both. Helen tapped her tablet. Your severance package is 16 weeks. Standard separation agreement with non-disparagement clause. Braden slid a folder across my desk. I didn't open it. I took my legal pad and my pen, a silver cross pen, engraved to Jim. Keep them safe. Dr. Howard Campbell from the day our first cardiac stent received FDA approval 9 years ago. I signed the paperwork. The non-disparagement clause said nothing about federally protected disclosures. But Braden wouldn't know that. Braden didn't read clauses. I packed what mattered. Legal pad, 2 photos, minus one of Sarah, one of Bryce at his high school graduation. The silver pen went in my breast pocket. I walked out of Roswell Medical at 4:20 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, 20 years after I'd walked in. If you've ever had a boss destroy something they didn't understand just because they could, you know how this feels. But let me tell you what happened next. My truck was parked on the 3rd level of the garage, 2011 Ford F-150, 155,000 miles. Runs fine. I put the box on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. I thought about Sarah. Not the gentle memories people expect. I thought about the specific week 4 years ago when she was in her worst chemo cycle, stage 3 ovarian cancer. The week she couldn't keep water down and Bryce, who was 15, stood outside our bedroom at 2 a.m. because he could hear her through the door. That same week, Roswell had its FDA pre-approval inspection for our first class through third cardiac device, the inspection I'd prepared for over 18 months. Every page of that submission binder, every data point, every response protocol, I stayed at work. I told myself the company needed me. I told myself the device would save lives, other people's fathers, other people's husbands. I told myself Sarah understood. She did understand. That's what stayed with me. The device was approved. It generates $840 million annually. It's extended an estimated 52,000 lives since launch. Sarah died 8 months later. At the funeral, Bryce asked me if I had to go back to work the next day. I said no. I stayed home for 4 days. Then I went back because the filing deadline for our next cardiac device was 6 days out and nobody else knew how to format the electronic submissions to FDA specifications. That's what 20 years looked like. The house was paid off. Sarah and I had cleared the mortgage 5 years before the diagnosis, back when we planned in decades. Bryce was 19 now, sophomore at NC State, playing baseball. Looked exactly like his mother. I wasn't financially trapped. Braden assumed I was. He calculated that a 48-year-old man with 20 years at one company would sign the severance and disappear quietly, because where else was he going to go? But here's what Braden didn't know. Those compliance files he'd shredded on camera, the quality management protocols, the CAPA documentation, the 510-kilo response letters, they weren't just historical records. They were active. They documented 12 known deficiencies that Roswell had self-identified under my supervision and was correcting through formal corrective action protocols. The FDA knew about these deficiencies because I'd disclosed them voluntarily and submitted remediation timelines with my signature on every cover letter. When Braden fed those binders into that shredder on a live-streamed company town hall, he didn't just destroy paper. He destroyed the only evidence that Roswell Medical was actively fixing known regulatory violations. Under FDA regulations that converts manageable compliance issues into willful non-disclosure of known deficiencies. And he did it on camera in front of 200 employees, with timestamps and metadata on a recording I'd already copied before walking out. I sat in that truck for 8 minutes. I didn't start the engine. I watched the concrete wall and thought about what I was going to do next. Not whether, what? Then I drove home. Bryce was at practice. The house was quiet. Rex, our yellow lab, met me at the door with his tail and that long look that means he knows something shifted. I poured 3 fingers of Maker's Mark. The good stuff, not the daily drinker. I sat at the kitchen table with my legal pad and silver pen and wrote down a phone number I'd memorized 12 years ago. At 6:15 p.m., I called Anthony Walsh. Tony picked up on the second ring. I could hear ice clinking on his end. Tuesday evening, which meant he was on his back porch in Raleigh. Same routine for 12 years. Jim, not a question. He already knew. They fired me today. Who's they? Harold's son, Braden, the one with the innovation title. Ice clinked again. Tell me everything. Start with the shredder. Anthony Walsh, 51 years old, partner at Walsh & Associates, pharmaceutical and medical device regulatory law, whistleblower litigation. We'd served together on the USS Baton Rouge. He'd handled legal administration while I ran medical supply 2 decks below. We'd eaten lunch in the same mess for 3 years. When he left the Navy, he went to Duke Law. When I left, I went to Roswell. We'd maintained monthly calls for 12 years. I'd never called him on an unscheduled Tuesday. I told him about the live stream, the town hall, the industrial shredder wheeled in like a prop. I told him about Braden holding up the binder and dropping it in like a punchline. I told him about the CAPA protocols in those binders. The 12 active remediation items, the fact that every deficiency had been voluntarily disclosed to the FDA under my signature with formal timelines. Tony was quiet for 6 seconds. He did this on a company live stream. 200 employees, 3 buildings, time-stamped, internally distributed, and I have 2 copies. 4 more seconds. Jim, do you understand what he did legally? Yes. Say it. He destroyed active remediation documentation for known FDA deficiencies on a recorded, internally distributed broadcast under 21 U.S.C. 360I and the medical device amendments. That's not records management failure. That's willful concealment of known regulatory violations. And the fact that he fired you the same day establishes retaliation against the person responsible for maintaining those records. Clean whistleblower standing if you file before this becomes public. That's why I'm calling you at 6:15 p.m. instead of waiting for Thursday." Tony laughed, one short breath through his nose. "You know the beautiful part? You didn't have to build a case. They live-streamed it. We worked for 4 hours and 23 minutes. Tony walked me through the filing process for the FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, step by step. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote every instruction in the same block print I'd used for supply requisitions aboard the Baton Rouge. At 11:38 p.m., I submitted the formal whistleblower complaint electronically. Filed, timestamped, documented. I closed my laptop, washed my glass, let Rex into the backyard. The October air was cool and the sky was that particular dark blue before stars fully commit. Bryce's light was off. He'd come home from practice while I was on the phone, eaten leftover pasta, left the plate in the sink. Smart kid. When not to ask questions, I went to bed at 12:05 a.m., slept 7 hours straight. No alarm. First time in 20 years, Wednesday morning, day 1 post-filing. I woke at 7:30. Bryce had already left for class. Note on the counter in handwriting that looked exactly like Sarah's. Made coffee. Didn't know if you had work. Back tonight for dinner. I poured coffee, black, and sat at the kitchen table. Rex leaned against my shin. My phone buzzed. Text from Linda Torres, 8 a.m. Photo of my old office. Empty shelves. Filing cabinets gone. Not emptied, removed. The desk had been replaced with a standing workstation. A man I didn't recognize was looking at a MacBook with the expression of someone recently told he was responsible for something he couldn't identify. Linda's message. They hired a consultant from automotive to transition the function. His name is Brad. Brad has never heard of 510 kilo. I stared at that photo. 9 years Linda had worked under me. She could have run the department herself, but they didn't ask Linda. They hired Brad from automotive. I typed back, "Keep your head down. Document everything." She responded, "Already am." That morning, Braden posted on LinkedIn. Linda sent me a screenshot at 9:05 a.m. 400 words, including organizational velocity, innovation friction, and sometimes leadership means clearing the decks so transformation can accelerate. The post had a photo of Braden in the conference room with the shredder visible behind him, artfully out of focus. Someone had taken that photo for him. 214 likes by noon, 97 from employees. I put my phone down and drove to Bryce's game that afternoon. He went 2 for 4 with a double. I sat in the bleachers with a vending machine coffee and watched every pitch. After the game, he climbed into the truck and looked at me with Sarah's eyes. "You seem different this week, less tense, like you're actually here when you're here." I adjusted the rearview mirror. "I'm working on it." We drove home. I made dinner. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about his swing mechanics and whether his economics professor was grading fairly. Normal things. Things I'd missed for 20 years because I was formatting electronic submissions for a company that had just replaced me with Brad from automotive. The days passed. I did nothing visible. That was the point. Tony called it the silence doctrine. Don't argue, don't beg, don't explain. Just stop being the thing holding it all together and let gravity work. Day 4, Linda texted. Brad asked what Kappa stands for in a meeting with QA out loud. Day 7, European distributor audit. Nobody knows where CE marking documentation is. Braden told them to circle back next quarter. Day 9, Linda called, voice flat, controlled. FDA reviewer for the cardio stent post-market surveillance called today. You used to handle it personally for 6 years. Brad took the call. Told the reviewer he needed to get up to speed and asked if they could reschedule for next month. I closed my eyes. In regulated medical devices, you don't ask an FDA reviewer to reschedule routine surveillance because you haven't read the file. That's not how it works. What did the reviewer say? I don't know. Brad didn't take notes. Day 11, Tuesday, 9 a.m. 3 FDA investigators arrived unannounced at Roswell's primary manufacturing facility in Research Triangle Park. They presented credentials and Form FDA 482 to the front desk. The inspection lasted 6 days. 6 days of FDA investigators walking production floors, pulling batch records, requesting documentation that no longer existed. 6 days of Brad from automotive standing in rooms with federal regulators, unable to produce a single Kappa protocol, a single remediation timeline, a single response letter because they'd been shredded on camera. 12 critical violations documented across every production line for both cardiac devices. Deficiencies that had been known, disclosed, and under active remediation. Remediation that existed only in binders, now confetti in a dumpster. Linda's updates during the inspection came like torpedo hits. Day 13. They asked for the master device file. Brad said he'd need to check with IT. Day 14. Investigator requested design controls documentation. Brad asked what design controls were. Day 15. They pulled our ISO certification. Found 3 expired supplier qualifications. Brad said we were in a transition phase. The preliminary findings were read to the executive team on day 17. Charles Davidson's voice was steady. His hands were not. The consent decree arrived day 34. Formal. Final. Addressed to Harold Cross as CEO. Manufacturing halted at 2 facilities. Both cardiac device production lines shut down on a Tuesday morning. The 2 devices that generated $1.6 billion in annual revenue stopped being manufactured. Stock dropped 41% in 48 hours. Day 35, 6:52 a.m., my phone rang. Harold Cross. I watched it ring for 7 rings. Didn't answer. Knew what it said without listening. At 9:45 a.m., I called Tony. Harold called. Of course he did. Stock's down 41%. His lines are dark. His general counsel is probably updating his resume. What did he say? Didn't answer. Good. Don't call back. Not until I tell you when. I understood the principle. When a submarine's supply chain fails, the first 24 hours are confusion. The next 48 are blame. After 72 hours, people stop looking for someone to punish and start looking for someone to save them. Roswell was at hour 72. Linda called that afternoon from the stairwell between floors. Our old secure line. Charles convened emergency board session this morning. Braden tried to present a remediation roadmap, 52 slides. He used the word pivot 14 times. I counted. How did the board respond? Margaret Caldwell asked him to define corrective and preventive action without reading from slides. Margaret Caldwell, board member 12 years, former VP regulatory at Boston Scientific. I'd briefed her before every quarterly compliance review for a decade. He said, and this is exact quote, "It's essentially a framework for post-incident optimization of operational outcomes." I set my coffee down. Margaret asked Charles to remove Braden from the room. He left, made a comment about how the board was resistant to innovation, then posted an Instagram story from the parking lot. Champagne emoji. Katchen said, "When legacy thinking meets disruption, disruption always wins." Day 38. Shareholder lawsuit filed. $127 million, named Braden Cross personally, not just as an entity. Institutional investors alleged willful breach of fiduciary duty and gross negligence in destroying active regulatory compliance records. Braden's lawyers, his father's lawyers, since Braden couldn't afford his own, filed for dismissal. The judge denied it in 4 days. The Livestream recording was cited in the denial. Exhibit A, time-stamped, metadata verified, 200 witnesses. Day 41, Tony called. "It's time. Harold's been trying to reach you through Charles." Charles called me twice this morning. He used please both times, which tells me everything about what's happening inside that building. What does Harold want? He wants you back. Consulting. Help respond to the consent decree. He's offering your old title plus oversight of the FDA response team. Full authority, unlimited budget, whatever you need. No. I know. But I wanted you to hear it, so you understand your position. They're not calling because they're sorry, Jim. They're calling because they have a consent decree, dark production lines, $1.6 billion in revenue evaporating, and the only person who can rebuild their compliance infrastructure is sitting in a paid-off house drinking coffee. What do you recommend? I recommend I call Charles back and say one sentence. Mr. Pearson has accepted a position elsewhere and is not available for consulting. Do it. You sure? Once I say it, Harold's next call is to a headhunter, and the next 6 months become a masterclass in how hard it is to replace someone irreplaceable. I'm sure. Tony paused. Good. Because Summit Biotechnology called me this morning. They want to talk. And Jim, you're going to want to hear what they're offering. Day 46. I drove to Summit's headquarters in a suit I hadn't worn in 2 years. The interview lasted 35 minutes. Dr. Catherine Reynolds, Summit's CEO, sat across from me with a printed copy of Roswell's consent decree and asked one question. Can you build it from scratch? I've done it before, She offered me the position that afternoon. Chief Compliance Officer, Summit Biotechnology, 1.8 million annual salary, 35 million equity package vesting over 4 years, full authority over regulatory infrastructure, reporting directly to the CEO with written guarantee of operational independence. I read every line of the contract, every clause, every subsection. Tony reviewed it for 3 days. We changed 2 words in the non-compete provision and added a sentence to the intellectual property assignment section. I signed day 52. Day 55, the board voted. Removal of Harold Cross as CEO, effective immediately. Not because Harold destroyed the files, but because he'd given his son authority over systems he didn't understand. When Charles had warned him in writing twice, he'd ignored both memos because he wanted to believe his boy was ready. Harold voted for his own removal. 8-0 unanimous. He stood up from that mahogany table, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without speaking. 31 years, 1 vote. Braden was removed the same afternoon. Security escorted him out carrying a box with a framed Harvard diploma and the Rolex he'd taken off rather than wear past the lobby. 3 months later, Roswell's board, desperate to salvage their cardiac pipeline, licensed 2 shelved device candidates to Summit at fire sale prices. Devices I'd shepherded through early phase submissions. Devices whose regulatory histories I knew by memory. Devices now sitting on my new desk, waiting for me to rebuild the documentation that would bring them to market under a company that understood what compliance meant. I found out about the licensing deal on a Wednesday. Tony called to tell me. I was reviewing a pre-submission meeting package and stopped mid-sentence. They licensed both devices. The terms are embarrassing. Roswell's board took pennies because they need cash to fund FDA remediation and can't manufacture anything until the consent decree is resolved. Based on what was destroyed, that's 16-18 months minimum. I set my pen down, the Silver Cross pen, still in my pocket every day. Some habits don't change. Some habits are the point. Tony, yeah, thank you. You did this yourself, Jim. I just filed paperwork. You filed it at 11:38 p.m. on a Tuesday because I called on an unscheduled day and you picked up on the second ring. That's what the standing call is for. Even when it's not standing. That Friday, I left work at 5:20 p.m., drove to NC State. Bryce's game started at 600. I was there by 5:45, in the bleachers with coffee, before warm-ups. Bryce went 1 for 3 with a walk, played clean defense at third. After the game, he climbed into the truck and sat there before putting on his seatbelt. You've been to every home game this semester. I have. You going to keep coming? I looked at him, 19 years old. Sarah's eyes, Sarah's handwriting, Sarah's way of asking a question that was really a different question. Everyone I can. He nodded. Put on his seatbelt. That night after Bryce went to bed, I sat on the back deck with Rex and 3 fingers of Maker's Mark in a glass Sarah bought at a craft fair 8 years ago. The neighborhood was quiet, no wind, just the stillness that comes when something wrong for a long time finally stops. Rex leaned against my shin. I reached down and put my hand on his head. Braden Cross, last I heard, was facing the 127 million shareholder lawsuit with no corporate indemnification because the board determined his actions fell outside authorized executive conduct. His LinkedIn profile had been scrubbed. The Instagram account was private. Harold Cross had retired to a house on the coast and hadn't made a public statement since the board vote. Roswell's stock was still down 32%. The remediation timeline was projected at 18 months. 170 employees had been laid off in the restructuring. Brad from Automotive had left after 9 days. And I was sitting on my deck in a paid-off house with my dog, drinking bourbon from a glass. My wife bought me, watching stars do what they do, whether anyone's watching or not. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It arrives quietly in a time-stamped federal filing at 11:38 p.m., submitted by a man at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a silver pen. Sometimes the loudest thing in the room is the person who stopped talking, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who doesn't understand what you built is simply stop building it for them. The thing is, I didn't set out to destroy anyone, I just stopped holding up what was already broken. When someone with no understanding of what you do decides your life's work is obsolete, the best response isn't anger, it's silence. Let them find out what happens when the person who actually knows how things work decides to step back and watch. If you're sitting in a cubicle right now, watching some 30-year-old MBA with a created title make decisions about systems they've never touched. Remember this: your experience isn't outdated paperwork. It's the foundation everything else stands on. And when they shred it thinking they're making progress, gravity will do the rest of the work for you. Document everything. Keep your copies. And when the time comes to walk away, don't argue, don't explain. Just stop being the thing that was holding it together. The silence will speak louder than any speech you could give.